changing. And every time, woohoo, we did it. We finished RoboFriends, we finished our app, now we can forget about it and it's going to live forever and ever on the internet, right? Well, maybe not. You see, part of using a library is something we've already talked about. A library or a framework is constantly evolving, constantly changing. And every time you use a tool, you usually want to stay up to date. This is one of the challenges with being a programmer, that you always have to stay up to date. I mean, sure, your projects could live on GitHub, but eventually they get stale. If they have a lot of dependencies or libraries that they depend on, then things might not work as intended. Now, this doesn't mean that you always have to jump on the latest and greatest. And as libraries come up with new features, you don't necessarily need to jump on them right away. But in these next couple of videos, I want to actually show you what my steps are and what most programmers' steps are when things change. Because if you have an application that is running, that has users, most of the time you want to keep things up to date. And this is something we've already talked about. But what about things like React? We learned about React in this course, and we're starting to get comfortable with it. But again, because it's a library, it gets updates because it's being used by companies like Facebook that has teams that constantly need new things, find challenges, and want to improve it. Ideally, things are always improving. So React had a big update. As of version 16.8, it got something called hooks. Now, if you know anything about React, everybody is going a little crazy with hooks because they are quite a big shift. They are exciting, but can also be intimidating for a beginner. And you can see over here in their documentation that they have a new section on React hooks. Over the next couple of videos, we're going to be talking about React hooks, what they are, why they're useful. But instead of just showing you point by point, as it is in the documentation, how hooks work, because let's be honest, you're able to do that on your own. That's what these documentations are for. I want to show you the process, how I would learn something new when a library changes, when a library has a new feature. Now, the reason I haven't talked about hooks up until now is that, well, even React documentation actually doesn't talk about hooks until way later in their guide. When you learn about React, their main concepts, some of the advanced guides, some API references, they don't mention hooks until the very end. So when you learn about React, it's good to put off hooks until you actually understand the concepts, which hopefully you do until now. So let's say React comes up with hooks. How would you go about learning it? Well, obviously you'd start off with the documentation and start going through it and actually understand it. Now, starting in the next video, we're going to learn about hooks, but I'm going to show you the process of how I would learn about hooks, and then also convert our RoboFriends app from using the class stateful components to using React hooks so that you can compare them side by side and see what the differences are. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. Let's learn about hooks and also teach you how the process should be when you learn something new with a library. Because again, your job as a programmer is to be really good at problem solving, be able to adapt to changes and solve problems. So let's say hooks was just introduced to React. The very first thing I would recommend to do is to read the documentation, but more importantly, read the motivation. Why did the library add this? Why did React decide to add this thing called hooks? Now we see over here that they're a new edition as of 16.8. And if you're watching this video now, there's probably a way later version of React. So as long as you're using this version or higher, you're going to be able to use this new feature. Now, I'm not going to read through the entire documentation for you, but I do want to point out one thing. The number one thing I do when I look at a library and see some of the new changes, I want to look at the motivation. Why did they add it? So if I scroll down, look at that, they have the motivation. Why do we need hooks in the first place? Now, sometimes to learn what the motivation is, you have to actually understand the library and have used it before. And hopefully by now you're comfortable with React. So let's just go through the motivation quickly and then we'll get to coding because I know that's the exciting part and that's when we'll actually learn. But the three things to keep in mind is that one, with the ways that we've used React up until now, it's really hard to do this. Reuse stateful logic. What does that mean? Well, if we had some logic of, let's say, changing state in our class components, sometimes if we want to do something similar in another component, it's a little harder to do with the way that we had it before. Hooks makes this a little bit easier. Again, something that we'll see shortly. Next is that complex components become hard to understand. You see, as components become bigger and bigger, especially class ones with component did mount, component did update, component will unmount, all these lifecycle hooks, things that can happen within a component. Hooks make things a little bit cleaner. You can see over here, hooks let you split one component into smaller functions based on what pieces are related. Again, hard to really understand unless we code it. But the biggest motivation, and I think this is something that a lot of people overlook when talking about hooks, is that some people find classes confusing. This keyword, the bind function that we have to do. Classes are just daunting for some people, such as doing super props. Why do we do that in a class? So hooks allow us to not use classes, not use the this keyword in our React applications. And another major reason that is overlooked is that React wants to do something called ahead of time compilation one day, hopefully for performance, something that things like Svelte, Angular, and Glimmer do. And by not having classes, it makes this easier for them to do so. But you know what? This is a lot of talk, a lot of gibberish, maybe hard to understand. I think the best way to learn about hooks is to actually convert our RoboFriends app from using class components to using hooks. And I'll show you what that means in the next video. Bye-bye. All right, let's convert our RoboFriends app from using classes to